Welcome back, everyone. Our next guest is an award-winning journalist, trauma researcher, and communications consultant who is making waves in the media industry.
In her groundbreaking book, The Trauma Beat, she reveals how the media impacts trauma survivors and how we all have a role to play in telling stories more sensitively. So we're so grateful to have Tamara Cherry here today with us. Welcome to the show.
I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
We're excited to talk to you about your career and, what you're doing now. So you were a crime reporter for almost 15 years, right? And then you started your own company called Pick Up Communications.
That's right.
And that term, pick up, is commonly used in crime reporting, right?
Yes.
When you were out in the field. So can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so when I started out as a crime reporter, a pickup referred to the act of basically going and getting a picture of the person who died in the latest tragedy in the city, and hopefully an interview with their grieving family members. So it was not uncommon for me to hear, Tamara, where's the pickup from the homicide last night? Or can we get a pickup of the child that was killed yesterday? Or Tamara, why did that newsroom get that pickup and we didn't? And so when I created my company, it was essentially to fill the gap, a very big gap in victim services that exists when it comes to the media. As a journalist, I was always showing up at people's doors during their darkest hours. And I was knocking on the door. They didn't know their rights. They didn't know, should I be talking to you? They were in such a state of shock. And then I would take their trauma from them, leave, and then the next journalist would come and knock on their door, and the next, and the next, and the next. So Pick Up Communications is my public relations firm that supports trauma survivors and the stakeholders who surround them.
Wow. Really important. So then the pandemic hit and you started a research project and you went and you interviewed 100 trauma survivors, which ended up forming the basis for this book. So at what point did you realize during your research that you were like, oh, I'm writing a book around this?
I didn't know there was gonna be a book. But when I got back my first survey results, so in the end, there were surveys that were sent out to survivors of homicide, traffic fatalities, sexual violence, human trafficking, and mass violence. And the first surveys I sent out were to homicide and traffic fatalities. You're seeing that graphic up there, across Canada and the United States. And people were shouting from the pages. The first woman I heard back from, her husband was murdered in Detroit. She literally had the media waiting for her outside the coroner's office after she identified her husband's remains. The second person I heard from was the mother of a young Black man who was murdered in Toronto. And again, screaming from the pages, media, why do you ask mothers of young Black men who have just been murdered, was your son affiliated to a gang? So there were so many things that I originally just wanted to create training materials for victim service providers, homicide investigators, journalists, but there was so much stuff in here, so much I learned. It was hugely transformational for me personally that I wanted everybody to know, because I think we as a society can learn so much from trauma to better support these people.
You touched on that with that one example with what questions we're asking, particularly of Black mothers. But in your book, you say that the way that the media covers these crimes, brings up existing trauma, but also can create new trauma.
Totally.
So you gave that example, but can you kind of expand on that?
Absolutely. So when I think about the 71 homicide and traffic fatality survivors who filled out one of my surveys, more than half of them said that the media contributed to their trauma. So we're seeing the top 6 negative impacts. More than half of them contributed to their trauma. Misinformation, another negative impact. Inappropriate images that were shown or details that were shared. Their privacy being invaded, media not following up with them. The feeling of being stalked, harassed, hunted, preyed upon by the media. We are causing harm just by virtue of the news gathering and storytelling process, just by virtue of me showing up at your door 12 hours after you've identified your murdered son in the hospital. When you have this cloud of shock, I am introducing new trauma because I am there to confirm that that most awful thing that your brain is not ready to comprehend actually happened. When I think about the responses I got from survivors of mass violence, think about the images that we see after, the latest school shooting. It's only a matter of time that we have that very dramatic cell phone video. You see people hysterical. You see bodies on the ground. You hear the sound of gunshots. That is triggering the trauma of potentially hundreds of thousands of people in the United States who have survived an incident of mass violence, sexual violence, human trafficking. I think about some of the stories that I did. I did a lot of reporting on human trafficking as a young journalist and interviewing some of the survivors and the invasive questions that I would ask. I didn't ask them, are you okay with this? It was, tell me about your childhood sexual abuse. What? what? Like, I look back on these transcripts now, I'm like, what was I doing? I was not creating these safe and predictable circumstances. So the images we show, the sounds that we share, the questions we ask, just by virtue of being there, and there's no like go-between to act as that barrier, we're causing harm in so many ways.
So Tamara, you don't want to sort of point the finger and lay blame. You are kind of asking for a complete overhaul of the system as it exists. So how can we all, also as consumers of news, take part and to do better when it comes to this?
So it's very important to point out, as you say, this can't just be on newsrooms. Newsrooms have to change a lot, absolutely. We need different stakeholders to come to the table. Law enforcement, victim service providers. Let's all start talking to each other so we can figure out how to tell these very important stories better. When it comes to news consumers, how many people here, consume true crime? Probably a lot. We demand that our coffee beans are ethically sourced. We demand that our clothing is not stitched by a 5-year-old in Bangladesh. We should be demanding that our news, these very, very important stories, are also being ethically sourced. So I think it needs to start with that. Think about the stories you're getting and the news you have versus the news that you want.
This is great work. Thank you so much for
you.
being here and for your honesty and looking back on your own experience,
Absolutely.
right? Okay, so everyone, this incredibly important book is called The Trauma Beat, and you can find it on shelves right now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back after the break.
Thanks for watching. We've got lots more discussion and debates on everything from food and fashion to pop culture and current events. Don't forget to click like and subscribe.